This video will demonstrate how to use the server-side validation controls that's in Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new project. It's going to be an ASP.NET empty website. Server-side validation controls. First thing I'm going to do is modify the web config file. It's a configuration file in XML. And what we'll need is an app setting element that will allow us to run this validation. And I will copy this XML to our lab. So it's going to come after the closing of System Web. Okay, and that's all you need to do. And then you can close this. Save it. The next thing I want to do is to create a new web form. We're going to go to right mouse click on our solution, click on Add New Item. And again, there's web form. You can choose to place the code in a code behind file or place your C# code right into the same form. For now, we'll do it this way. So we're going to import by going to Add Existing Item, our CSS. Just going to find it in my previous one. Now the CSS isn't here yet, and let me put my title. But instead of keying it in, you can also drag and drop the file in, and Visual Studio will write the code for you. Instead of copying and pasting the HTML, this time I'm going to use the tools from the toolbox, and they will be ASP.NET tools instead of HTML. If you want to use HTML in Visual Studio, you can drag and drop from the HTML category in the toolbox. You will see there's also a validation category, and that's what we're going to use today to write our validation. I'm going to change my default name for my form. And let's drag some labels. And a text box. Not in alphabetical order, unfortunately. Put in a break. Use some more another label and text box. Remember, one's for name in this example, and one's for gender. Your example, you have a few different fields than that. You have a grade field, for example. Put a couple breaks in, and then I'll grab the button element. So that's very similar to what we had. However, you do notice the ASP prefix here. Let's go ahead and change the text. Now, you can change it right in the source code, or you can go to the Properties tab. Labels, normally you don't need to change the ID unless you're going to update the label dynamically, which we're not going to do. So you can leave the default label IDs there. Here's the text. It says label, or you can come down to the text property and replace it here. And our label will say name, and this label will say gender. However, I do like to update the IDs for the dynamic fields. Since we're grabbing the input from the text box, I want to rename it to something besides text box 1. That's how you can get confused in your coding if you leave these default names here. And I'll call this the submit button because we'll be creating a click event for the submit button, and that'll enhance the readability. And I'd rather have this say submit instead of button. So you can just type all code. A lot of people like to do that, or you can go back and forth to the properties if you want to do that. If we go to this design view, you see here is our design. Actually, it's not the best rendered. You will see it renders better when we get to testing it in a browser. Let's think of some of the validation that we had for the text box. It was required. Go to the validation. You will see in the validation tools here, we do have a required field validator. So since both the name text box and the gender text box are required, we're going to drag and drop those near our elements that are being validated. So this is a required field validator. Again, I'm going to give this an ID that relates to what we're validating. There's two very important. You need to modify attributes or properties. One is the error message. You don't want the error message to say required field validator. You will also see that you can set the error message here. So I want the error message to say name is required. And this error message will say gender is required. Maybe I'll put a little asterisk so that it can get noticed. Let's go ahead and test this and see what it looks like. It looks like I tested a little too soon. There is a second property that you have to set, and that is the control to validate property. So I'll go ahead and turn that off and go back to my validators, and up here is the control to validate. And I would like the name to validate the name text box and the gender required field validate to validate the gender text box. Okay, we'll try it again. Here we are with our rendered HTML, and I click on submit, and you notice we get the error messages. The CSS is a little wonky here, but that's fine. We're mainly testing if the validation works. One thing I noticed I want to do is change the color to red. So there is a 4-color property that you can set. So that's the required field validator. The other thing I wanted to validate, that was gender was either male or female. Taking a look at the validation controls we have a compare validator, a custom validator, a range validator, a regular expression validator, the required field validator we just used, and a validation summary. Many times when a user completes a form, there may be several fields that aren't valid. The validation summary allows you to put all the invalid fields up in one box, in one section of the web page. It's a summary of all the invalid fields, so we're not using that. The gender is really a custom validation. The range validation would be like a numeric value between 4 and 60. I'm going to add a custom validator by our gender text box. And we'll have to write some code. Let's rename this to gender validator. In our error message, start with a star. Gender must be M or F. And we will check for uppercase. And I think right now I'll go ahead and change the 4-color. Now we need to write the code for this validator. What we're going to do is I'm going to come over to Design View, and you will see a rendering of that. Select that, make sure that's selected, and you will notice we have the lightning icon that represents events. So click on that, and then you'll see the server validate is the default event. The event could be like a button click event. However, for this validation control, the event is called server validate. So we're going to double click on that, and it's going to generate our server validate event for us, just like double clicking the button generated the click event. The args object is a parameter to this event handler, and it contains properties such as what the user had input. That property is stored in the value property. So we're going to look at the user's input and see if it's a male. See if they entered M or was entered. Now, if either of these were entered, then it is valid. Args has another property called isValid, and we'll set it to true. Otherwise, if it's neither of those, and I'm not going to check for the lowercase, so else, We'll set that is valid property of the ARDS parameter to false. And that's it. That's our custom validation that will execute. Finally, let's double click on the submit button. And the submit button does cause validation to occur. And in the submit button, we can check if this page, if any of these validator controls on this page is valid. So that's going to contain true or false. If it has executed this and this contains MF, and if all the required fields were there, then it's going to contain true. Page is valid, then I can go ahead and redirect it to our page 2. Let's go ahead and test this. Okay, the required field validator is working. And now the custom control validator is working. If I put a valid value in there, and I did get redirected. One other thing that I didn't do that is part of the requirements was a limit on the length that you can enter into the fields and those text fields. This is a very important thing to do to make sure that we're not getting some injection code, is limit how much the user can enter into these fields. And it would be good to validate on the server and on the client. Since these are server controls, they all are executed at the server, what we will do is select the text boxes, and there's a max length property. So set the max length property to 40 here, set the max length property to 1 here, and let's go and test this. So I'm going to go ahead and notice I've limited it to 1. Even though we don't have the HTML attribute that sets the length of this text box, I want you to go ahead and see what's happening. Visual Studio Active Server Pages takes the logic written in there and renders this into HTML. It's much more complex HTML than what we wrote. But let's take a look down here at our HTML, and it did render that name text box right here to have a max length of 40. So it takes the code written in the server side, but renders so that this is being done on the client side. It automatically will write the client side for you, which is an advantage. You don't have to think, well, I got to do it on the client and I have to do it on the server. You can do it. You can write it all on the server using these validator controls, and it'll make sure that the client and the server are handled well with the validation.